Ethan always knew he was adopted. It was a fact that had never really bothered him. His parents had raised him with love, and his life felt as normal as anyone else's. That sense of comfort and routine lasted until the day something strange happened, something that would change everything he thought he knew. It was an ordinary afternoon. The sun was shining, and Ethan decided to take a walk through the backyard, a place he had explored countless times before. But this time, something was different. A small patch of ivy growing along the far wall of the yard had shifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of something unusual underneath. Curiosity sparked in him. He approached the spot, pulling at the overgrown leaves until they gave way, exposing a small, weathered door that had clearly been hidden for years. It was so out of place, almost like it didn't belong in the backyard he had known all his life. Ethan crouched down, studying the door. His heart raced, the quiet buzz of excitement mixing with a strange sense of unease. Why had no one ever mentioned this before? He hesitated for a moment, but his hands moved on their own, reaching for the rusted handle. With a firm pull, the door creaked open. Behind it was a narrow, dark passage that seemed to lead underground. Ethan's pulse quickened. This was far more than he had expected. He glanced back toward the house, half expecting someone to come running, but the yard remained still. There was something both thrilling and terrifying about the hidden space. Without thinking, he stepped inside. The air was cool and musty, carrying the unmistakable scent of old wood and forgotten things. It was difficult to see in the dim light, but there was enough to make out the outline of what seemed to be a small room filled with forgotten boxes and old furniture, covered in layers of dust. As Ethan took his first steps deeper inside, that initial spark of excitement quickly faded, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He wasn't sure why, but something about the place felt wrong. Ethan's eyes strained to adjust to the dim light as he stepped fully into the room. The air inside was heavy and stale, carrying a thick, almost oppressive silence. His shoes scuffed against the wooden floor, the sound echoing faintly off the old, dust-covered walls. He tried to keep his breath steady, but the tightness in his chest made it difficult. The room itself was small, cluttered with the kind of things that had clearly been abandoned long ago. Old furniture, its fabric torn and faded, leaned awkwardly against the walls. Wooden crates, stacked haphazardly, filled one corner, some of them splintering from age. Ethan ran his fingers lightly across a nearby shelf, the thick layer of dust leaving a trail on his hand. It was as though time had stopped in this place. He glanced over at a large, heavy-looking box that sat against the far wall. Unlike the rest of the room, this box was different, newer somehow. It stood out sharply from the rest of the forgotten debris. Ethan approached it slowly, a chill running down his spine as he got closer. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched the cold metal latch. The box was locked, but the lock itself looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. He pulled at it, but it wouldn't budge. There was something unsettling about the box, something that made him feel as if it was keeping something hidden that should have remained undiscovered. Stepping back, he took in the room again, his mind racing with questions. Why was there a hidden door in his backyard? Why had his parents never mentioned this room? And what exactly was inside that box? As Ethan turned to leave, the shadows seemed to press in on him, as if the room itself was watching him, waiting. The moment he crossed the threshold back into the sunlight, he felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was fleeting. He shut the door behind him, the ivy falling back into place. His heart was still racing, but he wasn't sure if it was from excitement or fear. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his thoughts. He had to figure out what this was, what this room meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that what he had found wasn't just an old, forgotten space. It felt like something much bigger, something that had been deliberately kept hidden. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about the room, the box, the shadows. He had to go back. The next morning, Ethan woke up feeling the weight of the previous day's discovery still pressing on him. He couldn't shake the image of the hidden room, the dust-laden furniture, and that mysterious locked box. As he ate breakfast, His parents moved around the kitchen, chatting about their plans for the day. But Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He wondered whether they knew about the hidden door, or if they had deliberately kept it from him. "Everything okay?" his mom asked, noticing his quiet mood. Ethan nodded quickly. "Yeah, just tired." He wasn't ready to bring it up. Not yet. There was a nagging voice in the back of his mind telling him not to mention what he'd found, at least until he could figure out what it meant. There was something about the way the room had been hidden that felt intentional, like a secret meant to be kept. Later that afternoon, when his parents had left for errands, Ethan found himself standing at the back door, staring at the patch of ivy in the yard. It was calling to him, tugging at his thoughts. He couldn't stay away. Grabbing a flashlight and a pair of gloves, he headed back outside. The ivy-covered door was right where he had left it, now fully visible since he'd cleared away the vines the day before. He hesitated for just a moment before pulling the door open again. The musty smell of the hidden room hit him immediately, but this time it didn't deter him. Ethan stepped inside with more purpose, his flashlight cutting through the dimness as he moved to the box in the far corner. The thick layer of dust on its surface hadn't been disturbed. Kneeling beside it, he inspected the lock again. It was an old-fashioned padlock, rusted slightly, but still sturdy. There was no way he could open it without the right tools. He stood up and looked around the room again. The old furniture, the piles of boxes, none of it seemed important, just the usual relics of time passing. But that didn't explain why the room had been hidden so carefully. Ethan began sifting through the boxes, moving aside faded photographs and yellowed documents. Nothing unusual stood out, at first. Most of it seemed like ordinary family memorabilia worn with age and time. Yet, as his hands moved through the contents of the boxes, he found one that was different. Buried underneath an old pile of papers, he found a small notebook with a faded leather cover. The notebook's pages were brittle and fragile, filled with handwriting that was barely legible, as if written in a hurry or under pressure. The dates were from decades ago, but the notes inside were cryptic, referring to events and names Ethan didn't recognize. There was one name, though, that appeared several times, circled in some places and underlined in others. The name Mason. Ethan had never heard the name before, but something about the way it was highlighted over and over again gave him chills. As he flipped through more of the notebook, he found sketches, rough drawings of the house, the yard, and something else. His hands shook as he realized the drawing matched the layout of the hidden room, and in one corner there was an X marked in the exact spot where he had found the locked box. Ethan's heart pounded harder. This wasn't just an ordinary room, and it wasn't just some random box. This place had a purpose, and someone had gone through a lot of trouble to keep that purpose hidden. Ethan sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, staring at the notebook in his hands. The drawings, the name Mason, the X marking the spot where the locked box now sat. It was all starting to feel too deliberate. He thumbed through the last few pages, but they were mostly filled with the same hurried writing and cryptic symbols. There were no clear answers, only more questions. The locked box, now more than ever, seemed like the key to understanding everything. Whoever had hidden it here had wanted it found by someone who knew what to look for. But Ethan didn't have the right tools to open it, and that frustrated him more than anything. He stood up and brushed the dust from his jeans, taking one last look around the room. The shadows seemed to shift with every movement he made, as if watching him closely. Ethan turned his flashlight toward the box, the light bouncing off the metal latches. The box had to hold the answers. And now, with the notebook in hand, he knew it was tied to something or someone important. But the longer he stayed in the room, the heavier the air felt, pressing down on him like a weight. He needed to get out of there. Back in his room later that evening, Ethan paced restlessly, the notebook open on his desk. The name Mason stared back at him, circled in thick black ink. He had no idea who Mason was or what his connection to the house could be, but it was clear the man had something to do with the box, and with that hidden room. The house was quiet now, His parents had come home completely unaware of what Ethan had been up to all day. Part of him wanted to confront them, ask them directly if they knew anything about the room, the box, or Mason. But something held him back. A feeling, deep in his gut, told him that he needed to approach this carefully. He didn't want to give away what he knew. Not yet. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He had to find a way to open the box without his parents knowing. He couldn't let them catch wind of what he was doing. For now, the hidden room and its contents were his secret. Ethan rummaged through his dad's garage, trying to stay quiet, as he looked for anything that could help him break the lock. He found an old toolbox tucked behind some paint cans, and inside, he spotted exactly what he needed: a small, rusted lockpicking set. He wasn't sure if it would work, but it was worth a try. His heart raced as he tucked the tools into his jacket and quietly made his way back to the backyard. The ivy still hung over the hidden door, though it was less concealed now. He slipped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. The room felt colder than before, the silence more pronounced. Ethan knelt in front of the box, his hands shaking as he pulled out the lock-picking tools. He worked carefully, the sound of metal scraping against metal filling the small room. His breath caught every time the tools slipped, but after what felt like an eternity, he finally heard a faint click. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly lifted the lid of the box. Inside, wrapped in thick cloth, was a set of old keys and a folded, yellowed map. Ethan's hands trembled as he pulled them out. The keys were heavy, their metal tarnished with age, and the map was fragile, the edges fraying. Unfolding it carefully, Ethan realized that the map wasn't just any map. It was of his property, with a specific spot marked in red. The same feeling of dread crept over him again. What was this place, and why had someone gone to such lengths to hide these things here? Before he could think further, he carefully rewrapped the items and put them back in the box. He had what he needed, but it only led to more questions. And now he had to decide what to do next. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the keys and the map were part of something much larger than he had imagined. Sitting on his bed later that evening, he carefully unfolded the map again. The red X marked a spot on the property, near the farthest edge of the yard, somewhere he hadn't explored before. His mind raced with possibilities. The keys, what could they possibly open? Were they connected to whatever was buried at that marked spot? Or were they meant for something inside the house? He held the metal keys in his hands, their weight cold and heavy, as if they carried the burden of the secrets they represented. The more he thought about it, the more Ethan realized that the map wasn't just leading him to some random spot on the property. There was a reason it had been hidden away for so long, and a reason why someone had wanted to make sure only the right person would find it. But why now? And why him? The next morning, Ethan knew he had to act, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, and there was only one person he could trust with something this strange: his best friend, Max. Max had always been the more cautious one between them, but Ethan knew that if anyone would believe him, it would be Max. During their lunch break at school, Ethan pulled Max aside, his voice low and urgent. "I need to show you something," he said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Max raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. They met up later that afternoon at Ethan's house, and as soon as Max stepped into the backyard, Ethan led him straight to the hidden door. The ivy had fallen over it again, but with a quick tug, Ethan revealed the entrance. Max's eyes widened. "What is this?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise. "I found it a couple of days ago," Ethan replied. His words rushed as if he couldn't get them out fast enough. "And there's something inside. You need to see it." He led Max inside the small room, the flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan pointed out the box and the contents he had found: keys, the map, and the notebook. Max examined each one carefully, his expression growing more serious with every new detail Ethan shared. "So, this map," Max said slowly, unfolding it on the dusty floor. It's showing a spot on your property. Have you checked it out?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. I wasn't sure if I should go alone." Max studied the map for a moment longer, then looked up at Ethan. "We should go," he said. "There's no way this is just a coincidence. Someone hid these things for a reason, and I think we need to find out why." Ethan nodded, feeling both relieved and nervous. Max's agreement gave him the push he needed, but it also made the situation feel more real. There was no turning back now. They made a plan to meet up after school the next day and head straight for the spot marked on the map. Ethan spent the rest of the evening trying to stay calm, but the anticipation gnawed at him. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was that red X on the map, waiting for him to uncover whatever lay beneath. The next day passed in a blur for Ethan. His mind kept drifting back to the map, the red X burning into his thoughts, urging him forward. By the time school ended, he was more than ready to meet up with Max and head straight to the spot marked on the map. As they walked through the yard, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, his heart racing as they approached the farthest edge of the property. This area was overgrown with wild bushes and tangled weeds, a part of the yard that his family had always left untouched. It wasn't hard to see why. The place seemed forgotten, as though no one had been back there for years. Max walked beside him, the map clutched in his hands as they neared the spot. "It should be right around here," he said, squinting at the faded lines on the page. They stopped in front of a dense patch of thorny bushes, the kind that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in ages. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "This is it," he said quietly. The red X on the map lined up with the exact spot they were standing on. Max nodded, and without a word, they both began pushing aside the thick bushes, revealing the ground beneath. It was slow work. The thorns scratched at their arms, and the roots seemed determined to stay in place. But after a few minutes, they cleared enough space to see the earth beneath. And that's when they saw it, buried in the dirt, almost completely covered by years of soil and plant growth, was the outline of what looked like a large, flat stone. It was worn and rough, but it was unmistakable. Max knelt down, wiping the dirt away with his hand. "This looks like some kind of cover," Max muttered, his voice low. "But what is it covering?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He could barely believe what he was seeing. The stone slab was about 3 feet wide, and judging by how solid it felt under his fingers, it had been buried here for a long time. But now, for the first time in who knew how many years, it was being uncovered. With both of them working together, they managed to loosen the edges of the stone just enough to lift it. It took all their strength, and their muscles ached with the effort. But finally, the stone shifted. Underneath it was a small, square opening leading into the ground. Ethan grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the hole. It wasn't very deep, maybe about 5 or 6 feet down, but at the bottom there was something glinting in the light, something metallic. Max leaned over, trying to get a better look. "What is that?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice barely a whisper. He could see it now, a small metal chest similar to the one he'd found in the hidden room, but much older, covered in dirt and rust. His heart raced as he realized this was what the map had been leading them to. Without thinking, Ethan lowered himself into the hole, his feet touching the cool earth at the bottom. Max watched from above as Ethan crouched down and carefully brushed away the dirt from the chest. The old metal was rough under his fingers, and the lock was even more rusted than the one on the previous box. "I need to get this out of here," Ethan called up to Max. With some effort, he managed to lift the small chest out of the ground and pass it up to his friend. Max examined it closely as Ethan climbed back up. "This looks even older than the other one," Max said, turning the chest over in his hands. "Whatever's in here, it's been down there for a long time." Ethan nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "We have to get this open." But just like before, the chest was locked, and this time, the lock looked even more secure. Max handed Ethan the chest, a frown on his face. "What now?" Ethan looked at the small set of keys he had found in the other box, One of them had to fit. His pulse quickened as he reached for the keys and carefully inserted the first one into the rusted lock. It didn't fit. He tried the second one. Nothing. With a deep breath, he tried the third and final key. The lock clicked. Ethan's heart pounded as he slowly lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in cloth and paper, was something that took his breath away. An old folded document brittle with age, and beside it a photograph, one that made Ethan freeze in place. It was a photograph of a man standing in front of a house that looked eerily familiar, but that wasn't what made Ethan's stomach churn. The man in the photograph looked exactly like him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the photograph. His hands shook slightly as he lifted it from the chest, the edges of the paper fraying with age. The man in the picture, standing in front of what was unmistakably his house, looked exactly like him. The resemblance was uncanny, almost as if he was staring at an older version of himself. The man's expression was calm, his eyes sharp and focused, but it was the familiarity of his face that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Max leaned in closer, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Ethan, that guy looks just like you. What the hell?" Ethan shook his head, unable to find words. His mind was racing, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Why was this man, who looked so much like him, connected to the hidden room, the map, and now this buried chest? Was this person related to him? But if so, why hadn't his parents ever mentioned him? Next to the photograph was the old folded document, its paper brittle and yellowed with age. Ethan hesitated for a moment before gently picking it up. As he unfolded it, the creases crackling under his fingers, he quickly realized that it wasn't just any document. It was a birth certificate. His eyes scanned the paper, searching for names, dates, anything that could explain what he was looking at. And then he saw it. The name listed under father. His heart nearly stopped. Mason Sutherland. It was the same name he had found in the old notebook, the name that had been circled and underlined over and over again. Ethan stared at the name, trying to process the flood of thoughts running through his mind. "Mason Sutherland," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's him." Max glanced between the birth certificate and the photograph. "That's who? Is that your biological father?" Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The pieces were starting to come together, but they weren't forming the picture he had expected. His adoptive parents had never mentioned anything about Mason Sutherland, or anyone by that name. And yet, here was this birth certificate, this photograph, and this hidden chest, all pointing to a man who looked just like him, his real father. Max stayed quiet, sensing Ethan's growing anxiety. After a moment, Ethan tucked the birth certificate and the photograph carefully back into the chest, his hands trembling. The air around him felt heavy, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him harder than ever before. "I have to ask them," Ethan said suddenly, standing up. "I have to ask my parents. They know something." Max stood up too, his expression concerned. "Are you sure? What if they don't know? What if they've been hiding it from you?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then I need to know why." Without another word, Ethan grabbed the chest, still containing the documents, and started walking back toward the house. His mind was spinning, a mixture of confusion, anger, and fear churning inside him. What had his parents been hiding? And why? The thought that they might have known all along and kept it from him made his stomach twist. Max followed closely behind, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. As they reached the back door, Ethan paused for a moment, his heart pounding in his ears. He had to do this. He had to confront them. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door, stepping inside the house. His parents were sitting in the living room, talking quietly, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Ethan stood in the doorway, holding the chest in his hands. His voice came out stronger than he expected. "We need to talk." Ethan stood in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. His parents, startled by the sudden interruption, turned to look at him. The sight of them sitting so calmly, unaware of what he had discovered, sent a surge of mixed emotions through him. Anger, confusion, fear. His mom glanced at the old chest in his hands, her expression quickly shifting from surprise to concern. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, standing up. His dad leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly at the chest. "Where did you get that?" Ethan felt his grip tighten on the metal box. He didn't want to dance around the truth anymore. There was no time for that. He set the chest down on the coffee table between them, the dull thud of metal on wood sounding far too loud in the tense silence that followed. "I found this," Ethan said, his voice edged with frustration. "In a hidden room behind our house. There's a door out there covered by ivy, and it leads to a room filled with old stuff. But this," he pointed to the chest, "this is what I found buried outside, marked on a map I found in that room." His parents exchanged a glance, their faces paling as Ethan spoke. His mom sat back down, eyes flickering to his dad, clearly unsure of what to say. Ethan's frustration grew, watching them stay silent as though they were weighing their next words carefully. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Ethan's voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but his resolve was firm. He reached into the chest and pulled out the photograph and the birth certificate, holding them up for his parents to see. "Who is this man? Why does he look exactly like me?" His mom's eyes widened as she saw the photograph, her hand instinctively moving to cover her mouth. His dad's face, however, remained emotionless, though a tense stillness hung over him. Neither of them said a word. "Answer me," Ethan shouted, the pent-up frustration finally bursting out. "Is this my real father? Why didn't you ever tell me about him?" His mom's voice cracked as she finally spoke, her words soft and filled with guilt. "Ethan, we didn't want you to know about that part of your past. We thought it was better if you didn't find out." Ethan's chest tightened. "Didn't find out what? That my real father was someone named Mason Sutherland? That you've been hiding this from me my whole life?" His dad finally stood up, his expression still stern but his voice quieter than usual. "We didn't want you to carry that burden, Ethan. Mason Sutherland, your biological father. He wasn't someone we thought you needed to know about." Ethan took a step back, his mind spinning. "What are you talking about? Who was he? Why would you hide this from me?" His mom reached out, tears welling in her eyes. "Mason wasn't a good man, Ethan. He was involved in things, dangerous things. We were trying to protect you. You were just a baby when we adopted you. We thought it was best to give you a fresh start." Ethan felt his world tilt slightly. "Dangerous? What do you mean by that? What did he do?" His dad's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he wasn't going to answer. But then he exhaled sharply, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. "Your biological father was mixed up in criminal activity. There were rumors about him. People said he was involved in things that put a lot of people in danger. He disappeared before you were even old enough to remember him." Ethan stared at his parents, the weight of their words settling heavily in his mind. He had grown up believing his life had been relatively simple, but now he was learning that the past he'd never known had been shrouded in secrecy and danger. His mother's voice broke through his thoughts. "We never wanted to lie to you, Ethan. We just didn't want you to be dragged into that part of your past. We love you. You're our son, and we thought it was better if you didn't carry the burden of your father's mistakes." Ethan's anger softened slightly, but the hurt remained. He wasn't sure what to say, what to think. All of this, his real father, the hidden room, the buried chest, it had been hidden from him for so long. And now that the truth was out, it didn't feel like the relief he'd hoped for. Instead, it felt like a weight that was only growing heavier. "I deserve to know," Ethan whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I deserve to know the truth." His parents sat in silence, the guilt evident in their eyes, but they had no words left to offer. The tension in the room hung thick in the air, the silence stretching on as Ethan tried to process everything he had just heard. His real father, Mason Sutherland, a name that had meant nothing to him until now, was suddenly at the center of his identity. The weight of it all sat heavily on his chest, and the shock of the discovery still hadn't fully settled in. His parents sat across from him, their expressions a mixture of guilt, fear, and regret. Ethan could tell they hadn't intended to hurt him, but the betrayal still stung. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why wait until now, when I had to find out on my own?" His mom spoke first, her voice shaky. We thought we were doing the right thing. We didn't want you to grow up with that part of your past haunting you. Mason disappeared, and after we adopted you, we wanted to give you a fresh start. We never thought this would come back." Ethan's dad nodded, though his expression remained tense. "We didn't think you'd ever have to deal with it. We thought Mason's past had been buried along with him." Ethan clenched his fists, the frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "But it didn't stay buried. It's here, right in front of me. I've been living in this house my whole life, and you never thought to tell me that there's a hidden room in the backyard, or that you've been keeping a box filled with old secrets." His dad's face softened, his voice quieter now. "We didn't know about the room, Ethan. We never went back there. The house has always had its mysteries, but we thought they were just that. Old forgotten things that didn't matter anymore." His mom nodded in agreement. "We had no idea what you found out there. But when we adopted you, we knew about your father's past. We thought we were leaving it behind. We just wanted to protect you." Ethan let out a long breath, trying to make sense of everything. The photo of Mason, his father, burned in his mind. The resemblance was too strong to ignore, and the connection between that man and the house he now lived in felt like a puzzle he had only just begun to solve. "What was Mason involved in?" Ethan asked suddenly. "You said he was dangerous. What did he do?" His parents exchanged another tense glance before his dad spoke. "There were rumors. We don't know everything for sure, but your biological father was believed to be involved in illegal dealings. People in town said he was part of some underground network, smuggling, trafficking. Dangerous people were after him." Ethan's pulse quickened. "And you knew this when you adopted me?" His mom's eyes were filled with sadness. "Yes, but we didn't know the full story. We just knew you were an innocent child, and you deserved a chance to grow up without that darkness following you. That's why we adopted you. We wanted to give you a life that Mason couldn't." Ethan's mind raced. The birth certificate, the photograph, the notebook, everything pointed to something bigger, something more complicated than he had ever imagined. Mason Sutherland wasn't just some random man who had vanished from his life. He was a key player in a dangerous game, and for some reason, that legacy had now landed in Ethan's lap. "And this," Ethan said, lifting the birth certificate, "this is who I really am? This man? He's part of me?" His mom's voice was gentle, full of love despite the tension. "Ethan, you are our son. We've raised you, loved you, and that's all that matters. Yes, Mason was your biological father, but that doesn't define who you are." Ethan stared at the paper in his hands, feeling torn between the life he had always known and the dark legacy he had just uncovered. He knew his parents had raised him with love, but it didn't erase the fact that they had hidden so much from him. And now, with all these new questions swirling in his mind, he wasn't sure what to think. "I need to know more," Ethan finally said, his voice stronger now. "There's still so much I don't understand. The map, the locked boxes, the hidden room. There's something here that Mason left behind, and I need to figure out what it is." His dad frowned. "Ethan, I don't think that's a good idea. Whatever Mason was involved in, it's dangerous. There's a reason we kept this from you. We didn't want you to get mixed up in it." Ethan shook his head, determination burning in his eyes. "It's too late for that. I've already found the clues. I'm already involved. I can't just ignore it." His mom's voice cracked. "We just want to protect you." Ethan sighed, looking at them both. "I get that, but this is something I have to do." They didn't argue further. The truth had been laid bare, and Ethan could feel the weight of it settling on his shoulders. But there was no turning back now. He had uncovered too much, and the only way forward was to keep digging, to find out what Mason Sutherland had left behind and why it still mattered after all these years. The conversation with his parents had left Ethan feeling both exhausted and restless. The truth, as hard as it was to hear, had only deepened his resolve to uncover more. There were still too many unanswered questions, and the few details his parents had revealed only fueled his need to dig further into Mason Sutherland's past. Later that evening, after the tense discussion had ended and his parents retreated to their room, Ethan sat alone in his bedroom. The birth certificate and photograph lay on his desk, illuminated by the dim glow of his bedside lamp. He stared at the photograph again, the resemblance between him and Mason unsettling in its clarity. There was more to this. He was sure of it. Mason hadn't just left behind a legacy of criminal activity. There were physical clues, locked boxes, hidden rooms, and now a buried chest. And that map. His fingers traced over the delicate edges of the paper as he studied the faded lines and markings. The map was old, but it clearly showed something specific about the property. The spot marked in red had already led him to one hidden box. But what if there was more? What if Mason had left a series of clues, breadcrumbs meant to lead to something bigger? Ethan knew he couldn't solve this alone, and after everything he had just learned, he needed someone he could trust to help him piece together the rest of the puzzle. The next morning, Ethan met up with Max at their usual spot near the edge of the schoolyard. Max had been quiet since their discovery of the chest, and Ethan could tell he was just as confused and intrigued as he was. "So, what happened?" Max asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Did you ask them about the photo? The birth certificate?" Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah. They told me everything, or at least what they know." He quickly recounted the conversation with his parents, explaining how they had known about his biological father's dangerous past, but had kept it from him in an attempt to protect him. As Ethan spoke, Max's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "So, your dad, he was involved in something shady?" Max asked, lowering his voice. "Like illegal stuff?" "Yeah," Ethan replied, feeling the weight of the words settle on his chest again. "But my parents didn't know all the details. They just knew he was involved with some dangerous people before he disappeared." Max was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to process everything. "And you think there's more to find? More stuff he left behind?" Ethan glanced down at the map again, the red X burning in his mind. "I do. There has to be more. The map led us to one spot, but I feel like there's something else. I don't know if it's connected to the house or if there's something else on the property, but I need to figure it out." Max looked thoughtful, then nodded. "Okay, I'm with you. If there's more to find, we'll find it." Ethan felt a sense of relief wash over him. Max had always been a steady presence in his life, and knowing he had someone to back him up made the burden feel just a little lighter. That afternoon after school, they made their way back to Ethan's house. The hidden room behind the ivy still lingered in Ethan's mind, but this time he wasn't interested in going back inside. Instead, he led Max toward another corner of the yard, where the map showed more markings and unfamiliar symbols. The farther they walked, the more the ground sloped downward, leading them to an area where the yard met the edge of a wooded area. It was a place Ethan had rarely visited, overgrown and dense, much like the rest of the neglected corners of the property. Max unfolded the map again, his eyes scanning the markings. "It looks like there's another spot nearby," he said, pointing to a cluster of symbols near the property line. "Could be another clue, maybe another hiding place." Ethan nodded, glancing around. The air was thick with anticipation, and the trees above them cast long shadows across the ground. There was something unsettling about being this far from the house, as though they were stepping into another world entirely, one that had been forgotten for years. As they continued walking, Max suddenly stopped, his gaze fixed on the ground ahead. "Ethan, look." Ethan followed Max's line of sight and saw it, another stone slab, half buried in the dirt and covered with moss. It was smaller than the first one, but just as worn and ancient looking. "This has to be it," Max said, his voice low. Ethan crouched down beside the stone, brushing away the moss with his hand. Beneath it, he could see faint engravings, symbols that matched the ones on the map. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization sank in. Whatever lay beneath this stone was another piece of the puzzle. Ethan's hands trembled as he cleared away the last of the dirt and moss from the stone slab. The faint engravings were almost completely worn down by time, but they matched the symbols on the map, confirming they were in the right place. Max crouched beside him, watching silently, his expression tense with anticipation. Ethan's breath quickened as he ran his fingers along the edges of the stone, trying to find a way to lift it. This slab was smaller than the first one, but it was still embedded deeply in the earth. Max grabbed a nearby branch, wedging it beneath the slab to help pry it loose. With a grunt, the two of them heaved together, slowly lifting the stone just enough to reveal what was hidden underneath. The slab shifted, and with a dull thud it rolled to the side, exposing a narrow opening in the ground. The air around them grew still, as if even the wind was waiting to see what they had uncovered. Inside the opening was a small rusted metal container, similar to the first chest but much smaller. It was tucked into the earth, barely visible until they had cleared the debris. Ethan reached down carefully, lifting the container out of the ground. His heart pounded as he set it down in front of them, the old metal cold and rough beneath his hands. Max wiped the sweat from his forehead, glancing at Ethan. "You think this one's locked too?" Ethan nodded, already feeling the weight of the keys in his pocket. "Probably. Let's see if any of the keys fit." He pulled out the set of keys he had found in the first box, his fingers shaking slightly as he inserted the first key into the rusted lock on the container. It didn't fit. He tried the second one. Nothing. By the time he reached the third key, his pulse was racing. If this key didn't work, they would have to find another way to open the container. The third key slid into the lock smoothly, and with a soft click, the lock popped open. Max let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Here we go." Ethan hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the container's lid. The first box had held a birth certificate and a photograph, pieces of a past he hadn't known existed. But this box, hidden deeper and marked on a map filled with cryptic symbols, felt different. There was something ominous about it, something that made his stomach twist with unease. But he had come too far to stop now. With a firm push, he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in what looked like layers of decayed cloth, was a stack of old papers. The edges were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. Ethan reached for the top sheet, unfolding it carefully. As he read the first few lines, his breath caught in his throat. The papers were old legal documents, contracts, and letters, each one mentioning Mason Sutherland by name. But they weren't ordinary business dealings. These were agreements tied to something much more dangerous. Max leaned in, his eyes scanning the page. "What does it say?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper as he read aloud. These are contracts for smuggling operations, weapons, money laundering. Mason was running some kind of underground operation, and these papers, they're proof." Max's eyes widened. "That's serious stuff, man. If people found out about this..." Ethan nodded, his hands trembling as he turned the next page. The further he read, the more it became clear. Mason hadn't just been involved in shady dealings. He had been at the center of them, controlling an entire network of illegal activities. And these documents were evidence of his role, hidden away to keep anyone from finding out. "I think he hid these because he knew people were after him," Ethan said, his voice tight. "If this had gotten into the wrong hands, it would have brought him down." Max stared at the papers, his face pale. "So why leave them here? Why hide them on your property?" Ethan shook his head, his mind racing. Maybe he thought no one would ever find them. Or maybe there's more to it than that. Beneath the stack of papers was a small, leather-bound notebook, similar to the one Ethan had found in the hidden room. He picked it up, his fingers brushing over the worn cover. The pages inside were filled with notes, Mason's notes about meetings, deals, and people he had been working with. It was a journal, documenting everything Mason had been involved in. But one entry, written in bold, stood out from the rest. The key to everything lies with the well. Ethan's blood ran cold. The well, an old, unused stone well that had been at the far edge of the property for as long as he could remember. It had always been covered and forgotten, something no one ever paid attention to. Max frowned as he read over Ethan's shoulder. The well? You think there's something down there? Ethan closed the notebook, his pulse quickening again. I don't know, but we're going to find out. The well had always been there, a quiet, unassuming relic of the past, sitting at the farthest edge of Ethan's property. It had never crossed his mind that it might hold any significance, until now. Ethan and Max stood side by side, staring at the stone well, its crumbling bricks covered in moss and vines. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, as if the secrets buried beneath the surface were waiting to be uncovered. Ethan held the leather notebook tightly in his hand, Mason's final words echoing in his mind. The key to everything lies with the well. Max glanced at him, his voice quiet but firm. Are you sure about this? Ethan nodded, his heart racing. I have to know what's down there. Whatever Mason was hiding, it's the last piece of this puzzle. They had brought ropes and flashlights, prepared for whatever they might find. The cover of the well, a thick rusted metal grate, had long since been sealed shut, but with some effort they managed to pry it loose. The smell of damp earth and stone hit them as they pulled it away, revealing the dark, narrow shaft below. Ethan felt a wave of anxiety roll over him, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't stop now. He tied the rope securely around a nearby tree, testing the knot before looping it around his waist. Max stood beside him, holding the flashlight. I'll lower you down, Max said. Just be careful. Ethan gave a quick nod, gripping the rope tightly as he descended into the well. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and the air grew colder as he went deeper. His heart pounded in his chest, every sound amplified by the narrow space around him. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan's feet touched the bottom. He swung the flashlight around, illuminating the small chamber below. The bottom of the well wasn't just dirt and stone. It had been reinforced with concrete, and at the far side of the wall, there was something else. A hidden door, barely visible, built into the foundation of the well. Max, there's something down here, Ethan called up, his voice echoing. There's a door. Max's voice floated down from above. A door? Are you serious? Yeah, Ethan said, stepping closer to the door. It was small, made of wood, and looked ancient. He crouched down, running his hand over the handle, and to his surprise, it wasn't locked. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. Behind it was a small chamber, no bigger than a closet. Inside, resting on a stone pedestal, was a large metal chest, much like the others. But this one was different. It was far older, its surface covered in intricate engravings, symbols that matched those on the map and the stones they had uncovered earlier. The chest seemed almost otherworldly, as if it didn't belong in this forgotten well. Ethan's hand shook as he approached the chest. There was no lock this time. He hesitated for just a moment, then lifted the heavy lid. Inside the chest were stacks of gold coins, old documents, and something else, a series of small ornate boxes, each containing jewelry and rare artifacts. Ethan stared at the contents, realizing what he had just found. It wasn't just some hidden treasure. It was Mason Sutherland's entire fortune, the spoils of his illegal activities. But then, nestled between the valuables, was something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. A letter. It was addressed to him. With trembling hands, Ethan pulled out the letter and unfolded it. The handwriting was rough but unmistakable. It was Mason's. The letter was short, but its words cut through him like a knife. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you found what I couldn't. I made mistakes, terrible ones. But I did it to protect you. This treasure, it's dangerous. It's tied to people who will stop at nothing to get it back. You can choose to leave it here and walk away, or you can claim it and face the consequences. The choice is yours. But know this. I did everything I could to give you a better life. Whatever you decide, remember who you are." Ethan's chest tightened as he read the last line. Mason had been many things, but this letter felt like a final attempt at redemption, a way to leave his past behind and offer Ethan a way out. Max's voice broke the silence. "Ethan, what did you find?" Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He looked at the treasure, the letter, the fortune Mason had left behind. He had spent weeks trying to uncover the truth, to understand who his real father was. And now, standing at the heart of it all, he realized that this decision, the one Mason had left to him, wasn't about the money or the artifacts. It was about what kind of person Ethan wanted to be. With a deep breath, Ethan folded the letter and placed it back in the chest. He stood up, his mind made up. "We're leaving it," he called up to Max. "All of it." Max stared down at him, confused. "Are you sure? I mean, this is—" "I'm sure," Ethan said firmly, grabbing the rope and beginning to climb back up. "This isn't my legacy. It's his, and I don't want any part of it." As Ethan reached the top of the well, Max helped him out, still trying to understand what had just happened. But Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a clarity he hadn't had before. Mason's past had been buried deep, hidden in the shadows of his family's history. But Ethan had found the truth, and now he knew what he had to do. He wasn't Mason Sutherland. He was Ethan, and his life, the life his parents had given him, wasn't tied to the darkness of Mason's mistakes. And that was all that mattered. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I work hard on these stories, and your support means a lot to me. Thank you for being part of this journey.